The power of armies is measured by their gains in the air, land, and sea. Especially in the wars of two countries bordering each other, land operations have a great importance in influencing the course of the war. The most effective equipment used in these operations are undoubtedly tanks and armored combat vehicles. This is clearly visible in the Russia-Ukraine war. Although the Russian army attacks the regions bordering Ukraine with tanks and armored vehicles, the Ukrainian army manages to repel almost all of these attacks. A new video released by the Ukrainian Security Service recently shows the blow dealt to the ground forces of the Russian invaders. In one night, the Ukrainian army blew up 10 Russian tanks in a successful operation. Before we go into details of the spectacular attack, we have a request for you. As Anka Daily News Team, we continue to report all the developments in the Russia-Ukraine war, both on the front line and in diplomacy, with our understanding of accurate and impartial journalism. You can click the Super Thanks button to support our teammates and our work. Footage of the attacks in which 10 Russian tanks were blown up was shared on the official social media account of the Ukrainian Security Service. It appears that the footage was recorded by the camera of an unmanned aerial vehicle. The Ukrainian army carried out a series of attacks on the occupation zones where Russian tanks were concentrated. In this operation, which showed the effectiveness of the Air Force in the war, the Russian invaders suffered great losses. Sharing the footage of the operation, the Ukrainian Security Service wrote in its post, 9 or 10? 10. Exactly how many Russian tanks destroyed the SBU White Wolves Special Force in one night? Our specialists of the Special Operations Center A conducted study of enemy equipment on the Donetsk direction. One BTR opponent also burned. Thus, 11 goals were scored on this own account. For one night, work was a complete victory. In the footage shared by the Security Service of Ukraine, bombs dropped by Ukrainian drones are falling on the tanks of the Russian invaders with pinpoint accuracy. The moment the bomb falls, the tank catches fire with a violent explosion. Moreover, this attack is not carried out in one area, but in several areas simultaneously. As the Russian tanks are blown up one by one, the Ukrainian army is getting closer to victory. Immediately after the Ukrainian army announced that they had destroyed 10 tanks of the Russian invaders overnight, Ukrainian Interior Advisor Anton Geraschenko announced a new loss for the Russian invaders. Geraschenko announced the loss of the invaders with a post on a social media account as follows. Soldiers of the Special Squad Code 9.2, together with 3,027 National Guards Brigade, tracked down and destroyed the pride of Russian defense industry, the T-90 Provorovy tank. Glory to Ukrainian defenders. The losses of tanks and armored vehicles of the Russian army are increasing day by day. In the past days, the Ukrainian army targeted the tanks and armored vehicles of the Russian invaders with attacks on the Bakhmut line. The 59th Motorized Brigade blew up the Russian tanks and armored combat vehicles, trying to advance in Bakhmut. Russian tank and armored vehicle platoon caught in an ambush by the 59th Motorized Brigade. The tanks of the Russian invaders were trying to advance in Bakhmut by covering their soldiers, but Ukrainian soldiers were aware of both the tanks and the soldiers they concealed. Russian invaders were being monitored instantly. Ukrainian soldiers stationed on the hills overlooking the city were waiting for the right moment to attack. The T-72 tanks of the Russian invaders were now clearly visible on the target of the Javelin missiles. The time was right and the missiles were fired. The missiles hit the tanks, and the tanks exploded. While the units of the 59th Motorized Brigade were blowing up Russian tanks, another brigade unit was pursuing the BMP armored vehicles of the Russian invaders. Ukrainian soldiers opened heavy fire on Russian armored vehicles. Russian invaders driving the vehicle lost control. The cornered armored vehicles were neutralized by artillery shelling. Russia continues to suffer huge losses in Bakhmut. With these operations, the impact of the Ukrainian Air Force in the war is clearly demonstrated. In the Russian-Ukrainian war, along with the ongoing clashes in the occupied territories, a series of new developments are taking place in the airspace of both countries. For this reason, fighter jets, helicopters, and missiles are effectively in air operations as tanks and armored vehicles are in ground operations. While the losses suffered by the Russian army on the ground are increasing day by day, the losses suffered in the air are also increasing. With the recent incident in Bakhmut, a new one has been added to the losses of the Russian occupiers. Bakhmut has witnessed hundreds of thousands of clashes in the air and on the ground since Russia began its occupation of Ukraine. So much so that the Ukrainian army announced that hundreds of clashes took place in Bakhmut in one day. Russian invaders lost tens of thousands of soldiers and tons of equipment in Bakhmut. The development in Bakhmut in the past day reveals the loss of the Russian Air Force. The 93rd Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army heard aircraft sounds while on duty in Bakhmut. This sound belonged to a Russian Su-24 model jet. The soldiers headed towards the area where the sound came from and saw the Russian jet in the skies over Bakhmut. But the Russian jet did not notice the soldiers. The brigade soldiers quickly began preparations to shoot down the Russian jet. The jet was clearly visible in the skies over Bakhmut. The Su-24 jet was flying sorties in the sky over the city. Ukrainian soldiers were ready to attack, but the Russian jet had disappeared. Ukrainian soldiers continued to follow the sky, expecting to see the Russian jet at any moment. And then it happened. The Russian jet was heard again. Everything was ready for the attack. The Ukrainian soldiers, watching their prey, started firing as the Russian Su-24 fighter jet entered their range. The fighter jet in the sky turned into a ball of flames with the accurate shooting of the Ukrainian soldiers.
Yes, contact!
As the downed plane glided towards the ground, the Russian pilot was ejected from the plane, thanks to the pilot ejectum system on board. However, there is no information about the fate of the Russian pilot. The details of the operation, carried out by the 93rd Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army, were announced by Andrei Yermak, head of the Presidential Office of Ukraine. After this announcement, Ukrainians felt pride and joy, while there was great sadness on the Russian side, because Russia was approaching exhaustion with the loss of soldiers and ammunition. With this loss, the Russian Air Force lost a total of 305 airplanes, 290 helicopters, and 2,159 unmanned aerial vehicles during the war. The Ukrainian army continues to terrorize the Russian invaders with a series of attacks in the air and on the ground. While Russian leader Vladimir is wondering how to continue the war with these losses, the Russian people are calling on Putin to end the war as soon as possible. But Putin is not likely to give up the war, because his personal interests are above everything. Putin is putting his people in the fire for himself. How do you interpret the successful offensive of the Ukrainian army? Will the Russian invaders be able to recover their losses? What will be the next move of the Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who is getting exhausted every day? What are your thoughts on the course of the war? We are curious about your views. Follow us for more updates.
All rights to these videos belong to Anka Daily News YouTube channel. Our Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook usernames are @AnkaDailyNews. Do not rely on any other social media publications. We legally fight all websites and channels that use it without our permission.
Thanks for watching. You can support us by subscribing to our channel.